What she was about to discover hidden inside the walls of a crumbling 1940s farmhouse would expose a decades-old conspiracy and put her family directly in the crosshairs of federal agents, who had spent 70 years keeping these secrets buried. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from and if this resonates with you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's revelation will blow your mind even more. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from and if this resonates with you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's revelation will blow your mind even more. But let's start from the beginning. The rolling cornfields of Cedar County. Iowa stretched endlessly under the autumn sky, their golden stalks rustling in. The October wind like whispered secrets across generations of farmland. The small agricultural community of Millfield had maintained its quiet rhythm for over a century, where everyone knew their neighbor's business and change came slowly, if at all. Population 847, according to the weathered sign at the town limits. Though that number had been declining steadily as young people left for opportunities in Des Moines or Iowa City, Maria Gonzalez had never imagined she'd own property anywhere, let alone in rural Iowa where her olive skin and accented English made her stand out in a community that was still adjusting to the growing Hispanic population drawn by agricultural work. At 29, she was drowning in a perfect storm of financial disasters that seemed designed to crush any hope of stability or the American dream she had worked so hard to achieve. Her 6-year-old son, Diego's severe asthma required expensive medications and frequent emergency room visits that her insurance barely covered, leaving her with medical bills that consumed most of her income from 2 grueling part-time jobs. She cleaned office buildings in downtown Des Moines from midnight to 6 a.m., then rushed home to get Diego ready for school before starting her afternoon shift at Rosie's Diner, where she served coffee and comfort food to construction workers and office employees who left tips that made the difference between buying groceries and choosing between food and Diego's inhaler refills. The divorce 8 months earlier had been financially catastrophic in ways that still made Maria's stomach clench when she thought about it. Her ex-husband Marcus had not only refused to pay child support, but had actually emptied their joint savings account and disappeared to parts unknown, leaving Maria with rent she couldn't afford on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment and no safety net. When Diego's medical emergencies inevitably arose, the apartment itself had become a source of constant stress. Located in a rundown complex on the east side of Des Moines, it featured thin walls that carried every argument, television show, and domestic dispute from their neighbors, creating an environment where Diego's sleep was frequently interrupted by noise that triggered his anxiety and consequently his asthma attacks. The building's heating system was unreliable, the air conditioning was non-existent, and the landlord's approach to maintenance requests ranged from indifferent to hostile. Maria had been 3 days away from eviction, with exactly $247 in her checking account and Diego's inhaler prescription due for a refill she couldn't afford, when the certified letter arrived from Hendricks, Morrison & Associates, a law firm in Cedar Rapids that she'd never heard of. The return address label was formal and intimidating, the kind of correspondence that usually meant more bad news in a life that had already provided more than its share of challenges. Ms. Gonzalez, formal letterhead had read in language that took her several careful readings to fully comprehend. We regret to inform you of the passing of Esperanza Morales, your great-grandmother's sister. Ms. Morales passed away peacefully at Cedar County Memorial Hospital on September 15th after a brief illness. As the only surviving relative we were able to locate after an extensive genealogical search, you have inherited her property at 847 County Road 15, Millfield, Iowa, including the farmhouse, all outbuildings, and the surrounding 38 acres of agricultural land. Maria had stared at the letter for a full 10 minutes, reading and rereading the words as if they might change or disappear. Convinced that someone had made a mistake, or that this was some kind of cruel joke. She had never heard of Esperanza Morales, knew nothing about any relatives in Iowa. Certainly had no idea that someone she'd never met had considered her worthy of such an enormous inheritance. Her grandmother had died when Maria was 12, and family history had always been vague in the way that often characterized immigrant families who had focused more on survival and assimilation than on preserving detailed genealogical records. Her mother had mentioned distant relatives occasionally, but always in the context of people who had lost touch decades ago. It's not people who might be tracking down descendants for inheritance purposes. The law firm's subsequent phone call had provided a few additional details, but confirmed the shocking reality of her situation. Attorney James Morrison had explained that Esperanza had lived alone on the property for over 60 years, had never married or had children, and had apparently spent considerable effort in her final years working with genealogists to track down distant relatives who might inherit her life's work. Ms. Morales was very specific about her requirements for an heir. Morrison had explained in his careful legal language. She wanted to find a young family, preferably with children, who would appreciate the property and continue the traditions of rural life that she had maintained for so many decades. When she learned about your situation, a single mother working hard to provide for a child with medical needs, she felt confident that you would be the right person to inherit her legacy. The revelation that Esperanza had somehow researched Maria's circumstances was both touching and slightly unsettling. How had an elderly woman in rural Iowa learned about Diego's asthma, their financial struggles, and their family situation? Morrison had been vague about the specifics, mentioning only that Esperanza had been very thorough in her research and had made inquiries through appropriate channels. The property comes with no mortgage or liens, Morrison had continued, but it does require significant repairs and maintenance that have been deferred for many years. Ms. Morales was increasingly unable to maintain the buildings and land in her final years, though she did make some important updates to ensure the house would be suitable for a family with specific needs. The photographs Morrison's office provided showed a 2-story white farmhouse with green shutters, its paint peeling to reveal weathered wood beneath, surrounded by overgrown fields and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Wrap-around porch sagged in places, the front steps needed replacement, and the overall appearance suggested a property that had been loved, but not properly maintained for several years. It looked like a massive restoration project that would require skills and resources Maria didn't possess. But it also represented something she had never dared hope for, the possibility of stability, real ownership, and a home where Diego could grow up with space to breathe, literally and figuratively. The mounting medical bills and constant stress of city life had been slowly destroying both of them. Diego's asthma had worsened significantly since the divorce, triggered by the anxiety of watching his mother work herself to exhaustion while still struggling to meet their basic needs. Their apartment building was a nightmare of environmental triggers: cigarette smoke from neighboring units, mold in the bathroom that the landlord refused to address, and dust from ongoing renovations that seemed designed more to justify rent increases than to improve living conditions. The pediatric pulmonologist at Mercy Medical Center had mentioned multiple times that rural air quality and reduced stress might help Diego's condition. But moving had seemed impossible until Esperanza's unexpected gift made it a real possibility. Dr. Sarah Chen had been treating Diego for 2 years, watching his condition fluctuate with their living circumstances and family stress levels in ways that broke Maria's heart. "Diego, what do you think about moving to a farm?" Maria had asked one evening as they sat at their tiny kitchen table, reviewing yet another stack of medical bills while Diego worked on homework between puffs from his rescue inhaler. His eyes had lit up with excitement, tempered by the practical concern that 6-year-olds shouldn't need to worry about. Would I still be able to see Dr. Chen for my breathing? And would we have enough money for my medicines? "There are good doctors in Iowa City about an hour away from where we'd be living," Maria had replied. Having already spent hours researching pediatric pulmonology services in the area, and because we wouldn't have to pay rent anymore, we'd have more money for your medications and doctor visits. "Can we have a dog? And maybe chickens, like in my picture books?" Maria had smiled at his enthusiasm, remembering her own childhood. Dreams of animals and space that had never been possible in their urban circumstances. Her own grandmother had told stories about life on a small farm in Mexico, describing chickens and gardens and the kind of self-sufficiency that had seemed like fairy tales to a girl growing up in city apartments. "If we can make it work, yes, we can have animals and all the space you want to run around without worrying about bothering the neighbors." The decision had been made with the kind of desperate hope that comes from having limited options and unlimited determination to build a better life for your child. Maria gave notice at both jobs, arranged for Diego's medical records to be transferred to pediatric specialists in Iowa City, and used their entire savings accounts, $743, accumulated through months of choosing between necessities, to rent a small moving truck for their modest possessions. The process of leaving Des Moines felt surreal after 3 years of struggling to survive in a city that had never quite felt like home. Their apartment, despite its problems, had represented their only stability. Abandoning that security for the unknown felt both terrifying and liberating. Diego's teachers at his elementary school were sorry to see him go, but excited about his opportunity for a fresh start in an environment that might better support his health. The 3-hour drive from Des Moines to Millfield took them through Iowa's changing landscape, from urban sprawl to suburban developments to endless agricultural land that seemed untouched by modern complications. Diego pressed his face against the passenger window of their rented truck, documenting their journey with excited observations about tractors, silos, and farm animals that had existed only in picture books during their city life. "Mom, look how big everything is," he said with wonder as they crested a hill and saw the valley spread below them. Cornfields stretching toward distant hills that looked blue in the afternoon haze. "There's so much space that nobody's using for anything." "That's going to be an adjustment for both of us," Maria replied, feeling her own mixture of excitement and terror as she contemplated the isolation that would soon become their reality. In the city, help was always nearby neighbors, emergency services, stores, and medical facilities. Here, they would be largely on their own, dependent on their own resourcefulness and the goodwill of neighbors they hadn't met yet. The Morales. Farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane that wound through mature oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red with the advancing season. The driveway curved past fields where corn had been harvested weeks earlier, leaving stubbled ground that stretched toward distant tree lines. The 2-story structure looked exactly like the photograph's white paint peeling to reveal weathered gray wood beneath, green shutters hanging askew, a wraparound porch that showed its age in sagging boards and missing sections of railing. But the bones were clearly solid. The roof appeared intact despite some missing shingles, and the setting offered views of rolling countryside that Diego had never seen from their apartment windows. The property included a large red barn that looked surprisingly well-maintained compared to the house, a smaller building that might have been a workshop or equipment storage, and what appeared to be the remnants of extensive vegetable gardens that someone had carefully planned and planted. Years ago, "It's bigger than our whole apartment building," Diego observed as they pulled into the circular driveway beside the house, his voice carrying awe at the sheer scale of space they now apparently owned. "Everything's bigger than our apartment building," Maria replied, parking their rental truck beside a flower bed where someone had clearly invested considerable effort in landscaping that was now beginning to return to wildness, but still showed signs of thoughtful design and care. The key that Morrison's office had provided opened the front door with surprising ease, revealing an interior that told the story of someone who had lived alone for many years, but had maintained her home with care and pride. The furniture was outdated but well-preserved, the floors were swept clean, and everything was organized with the kind of methodical precision that suggested Esperanza had been preparing for their arrival even after her death. The living room featured floral wallpaper that had probably been fashionable in the 1960s. Furniture upholstered in earth tones that had faded but not worn through, and built-in bookshelves filled with volumes on gardening, local history, and what appeared to be an extensive collection of Spanish-language literature and poetry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by family photographs that showed decades of solitary life, punctuated by occasional visits from people who might have been distant relatives or close friends. The kitchen contained appliances that were avocado green and probably 30 years old, but everything worked and had been maintained with obvious care. The refrigerator hummed quietly, the stove lit properly, and the sink provided clear water that tasted different from city water, but was obviously safe and clean. A window over the sink provided a view of the backyard, where clotheslines and garden plots suggested that Esperanza had embraced the self-sufficient lifestyle that rural living made possible. Diego immediately gravitated toward a bedroom on the second floor that overlooked the valley, its windows providing a panoramic view of fields and forests that stretched beyond anything he had ever seen. The room was decorated with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested Esperanza had hoped someday to have children in her home, even though that dream had apparently never materialized. A twin bed with a handmade quilt, a small desk positioned to catch the morning light, and shelves that would be perfect for books and toys created a space that seemed designed specifically for a child who needed room to breathe and grow. Maria chose Esperanza's former room, which featured a sitting area with comfortable chairs positioned to catch the morning sun, French doors that opened onto the section of wraparound porch that offered the best views of the surrounding countryside. The closet still contained some of Esperanza's clothing, practical dresses, sturdy shoes, and a few pieces that suggested she had once dressed for occasions that no longer came but which she had preserved out of hope or memory. Their first week in Millfield provided a crash course in rural living and the unique challenges of maintaining an aging farmhouse. With minimal resources and no previous experience, the well water had a mineral taste that required adjustment, but was obviously healthier than the chlorinated city water they were accustomed to. The electrical system was old enough to make lights flicker when the refrigerator cycled on, but everything functioned safely. The heating system relied on a propane furnace that would require fuel delivery before winter, an expense Maria tried not to calculate too precisely until she could better understand their new budget. But Diego thrived in ways that surprised them both and validated every difficult decision Maria had made about their move. His asthma attacks decreased dramatically within days of their arrival, as the cleaner air and reduced stress of their new environment allowed his respiratory system to function more normally than it had in months. He could play outside without Maria's constant supervision, explore the barn and outbuildings at his own pace, and spend hours watching birds and wildlife that had been completely absent from their urban life. The local elementary school was small enough that every teacher knew every student's name, family situation, and individual needs. Diego's transition was smoothed by classmates who were genuinely excited to meet someone from the city, and who welcomed his perspective on their familiar world. His natural curiosity and enthusiasm made him popular with children who had grown up together and were eager to share their knowledge of rural life with someone who appreciated things they had always taken for granted. The school nurse, Patterson, had worked with asthmatic children for 20 years and immediately understood Diego's medication schedule and environmental needs. She kept backup inhalers in the nurse's office, monitored air quality reports that might affect outdoor activities, and coordinated with Maria to ensure that Diego's medical needs were seamlessly integrated into his school routine. Most importantly, for their long-term stability, Maria found part-time work at the Millfield Medical Clinic, where her nursing experience was desperately needed and her bilingual skills made her invaluable in a community with a growing Hispanic population drawn by agricultural work opportunities. Dr. Robert Martinez, no relation, despite sharing a surname, had been trying to find qualified bilingual medical staff for months and was thrilled to have someone with Maria's credentials and background. The pay was less than her Des Moines jobs combined, but the lower cost of living and the absence of rent payments made their budget actually work for the first time in years. More importantly, the clinic provided health insurance that covered Diego's medications and specialist visits, removing the constant anxiety about medical expenses that had dominated their previous life. "Mom," Diego said one evening as they sat on Esperanza's front porch, watching the sun set over a countryside that was slowly becoming familiar and beloved, "I think great-great-aunt Esperanza knew we would be happy here." "Why do you think that?" Maria asked, impressed by her 6-year-olds. Insight into the motivations of someone he had never met but whose generosity had transformed their lives. "'Cause she could have given the house to anyone, but she chose us. And look how perfect it is for us, a space for me to breathe better. A job for you that helps other people and neighbors who are nice to new people even when we're different from them." Maria smiled at Diego's logical assessment of their good fortune. Esperanza had somehow identified them as the right people to inherit her life's work, despite having no personal relationship or direct knowledge of their specific circumstances. beyond what genealogical research and distant inquiries might have revealed. But as September turned to October and Maria began planning winter preparations for their first year in the farmhouse, she started noticing details about the property that suggested Esperanza had been preparing for their arrival in ways that went far beyond simple inheritance planning or general property maintenance. The barn contained not just aging farming equipment, but carefully organized supplies for home maintenance and repair paint in colors that matched the house's original scheme. Tools that were well maintained and perfectly suited for the specific repairs the farmhouse needed, building materials and hardware that seemed specifically chosen for projects that Esperanza couldn't have undertaken herself, but had anticipated her heirs would need to complete. The workshop held sewing machines that were still in working order, craft supplies organized with museum-like precision, and equipment for food preservation that suggested Esperanza had expected her heirs to embrace the self-sufficient rural lifestyle that had sustained her for decades. Canning jars, dehydrating equipment, and even a small dairy setup indicated preparation for people who would want to grow and preserve their own food. Most intriguingly, several rooms in the farmhouse showed signs of recent renovation that didn't match the rest of the house's 1960s aesthetic. The bathroom had been updated with modern fixtures that were obviously expensive and had been installed within the last few years. The kitchen wiring had been upgraded to handle contemporary appliances, even though Esperanza herself had continued using the original avocado green models. The master bedroom featured new insulation and windows that significantly improved heating efficiency and noise reduction. It's like she was getting the house ready for us specifically, Maria observed to her neighbor, Ruth Henderson, during one of their conversations over the fence that separated their properties. Ruth was a woman in her 70s who had lived in Millfield her entire life and had been Esperanza's closest neighbor and, apparently, one of her few regular social contacts. Esperanza was a very thoughtful woman, Ruth replied carefully, her tone suggesting she knew more than she was initially comfortable sharing with someone she was still getting to know. She spent a lot of time in her final years making sure everything was in order for whoever would come after her. Did she ever mention family, or talk about why she chose me specifically? Ruth hesitated in a way that suggested she was weighing how much information to share with someone who was still, despite their neighborly relationship, essentially a stranger who had appeared in their community under unusual circumstances. She asked me a lot of questions about what young families needed, especially families with children who had medical concerns. She seemed very interested in making sure the house would be suitable for someone in your exact situation, a single mother with a child who had respiratory problems. The conversation left Maria with more questions than answers about Esperanza's motivations and the extent of her knowledge about their circumstances. How had a woman she'd never met learned enough about Diego's asthma and their financial situation to prepare the farmhouse specifically for their needs? The level of detail in the preparations suggested research that went far beyond what typical inheritance planning might require. The answer would begin to emerge in October, when Maria decided to tackle the farmhouse's most obvious cosmetic problem, the peeling exterior paint that made their home look abandoned rather than loved. The house was structurally sound and functionally adequate, but its appearance was beginning to embarrass Maria as she established herself in the community and wanted to demonstrate that she was a responsible homeowner who took pride in her property. Diego was helping her move furniture away from the living room walls so she could assess what interior painting might be needed. When they discovered that some of the floral wallpaper was coming loose near the fireplace, apparently loosened by seasonal humidity changes and the age of whatever adhesive had been used decades earlier. "Mom, there's something underneath the flower paper," Diego announced. We're picking at a corner where the wallpaper had separated from the wall, revealing what appeared to be different colored paint or possibly another layer of wallpaper beneath the current decoration. Maria approached to investigate, finding that the floral wallpaper was actually covering an earlier layer of decoration, what appeared to be plain white paint that had been applied over something else. As she carefully pulled back more of the wallpaper, being cautious not to damage the wall beneath, she discovered that the white paint was covering pencil markings that looked like notes or calculations written directly on the plaster. "Diego, go get my flashlight from the kitchen drawer," she said. suddenly very interested in what might be hidden beneath decades of wallpaper and paint layers that had obviously been applied to conceal rather than simply redecorate. The pencil. Markings, when illuminated properly with the flashlight beam, appeared to be dates, names, and what looked like financial notations, written in small, careful script that suggested systematic record-keeping rather than casual household notes. But they weren't random grocery lists or family reminders. They had the organized appearance of important information that someone had deliberately preserved by writing it directly on the wall before covering it with paint and wallpaper. As Maria carefully removed more wallpaper from the area around the fireplace, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever was beneath, she realized that the entire wall contained layer upon layer of hidden writing, charts, and what appeared to be carefully preserved documentation of activities someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal, while also ensuring their preservation. Some of the writing appeared to be in Spanish, which Maria could read, while other portions were in English, or possibly other languages that she couldn't immediately identify. The dates spanned several decades, beginning in what looked like the 1940s and continuing through the 1970s, suggesting that whoever had created these records had been documenting something for over 30 years. "Mom, what is all that writing?" Diego asked, studying the emerging patterns with 6-year-old fascination that was unencumbered by adult concerns about why someone might hide important information in the walls of their house. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Maria replied, feeling both excitement and apprehension about what they were uncovering. "But I think Esperanza left us more than just a farmhouse. The discovery that would change everything was just beginning to reveal itself hidden beneath decades of careful concealment in the walls of a house that had been prepared specifically for someone with the curiosity and courage to uncover its secrets." As Maria continued removing wallpaper, she found names that she recognized from local history, dates that corresponded to significant events in Iowa's agricultural development, and numbers that suggested financial transactions or record-keeping that went far beyond what an elderly woman living alone might be expected to maintain. Most disturbing were references to what appeared to be government agencies, federal programs, and activities that seemed to involve multiple people working together on projects that required the kind of secrecy that would justify hiding records. Inside the walls of a rural farmhouse, Maria Gonzalez, who had come to Iowa seeking only stability and a healthier environment for her son, was about to discover that Esperanza had entrusted her with far more than a home. She had inherited evidence of activities that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep buried. The story was just beginning, and Maria had no idea how much courage she would need for what lay ahead. The next morning brought an unseasonably warm October day that filled the farmhouse with golden light streaming through windows that Esperanza had kept meticulously clean despite her advancing age. Maria had spent a restless night thinking about the hidden writing they had discovered, her mind racing with questions about what kind of activities would require such elaborate concealment and preservation. Diego had slept soundly for the first time since their discovery, his breathing easy in the clean rural air that continued to work miracles for his asthma. He woke excited about the mystery they were uncovering, approaching it with the kind of adventurous curiosity that only children could maintain when adults were beginning to worry about complications and consequences. "Mom, can we take off more of the flour paper today?" he asked over breakfast, spooning oatmeal while gazing toward the living room where yesterday's discovery waited for further investigation. "I want to see what else Great-Great and Esperanza hid in the walls." Maria smiled at his enthusiasm while feeling her own mixture of excitement and apprehension about what they might find. The careful preservation of records hidden beneath wallpaper suggested activities that went far beyond simple family history or household management. She was beginning to understand that Esperanza's inheritance might include responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. "We'll work on it this afternoon," she promised. "But first I need to go into town to pick up some supplies, and you have that field trip to the corn maze with your class." Diego's integration into Millfield Elementary had exceeded Maria's most optimistic expectations. His teacher, Mrs. Susan Palmer, was a 30-year veteran who had taught half the adults in town and understood how to help new students navigate both academic requirements and social dynamics in a small rural community she had immediately recognized. Diego's intelligence and curiosity, channeling his urban experiences into classroom discussions that enriched everyone's understanding of different ways of life. The corn maze field trip was a perfect example of how the school connected education with local agriculture and seasonal traditions. Students would learn about crop rotation, harvest timing, and the economic importance of corn production, while enjoying the kind of outdoor activity that Diego had never experienced in Des Moines. His excitement about the trip reminded Maria how much their move had expanded his world in ways that had nothing to do with their financial improvement. After dropping Diego at school, Maria drove to Henderson's Hardware in downtown Millfield, a family-owned business that occupied the same building it had inhabited for over 60 years. The store carried everything from farming supplies to household goods, operating with the kind of personal service that only existed in small communities where customers were neighbors and reputation mattered more than profit margins. Tom Henderson, Ruth's son and the store's current owner, greeted Maria with the friendly professionalism that had characterized all her interactions with Millfield residents. "Morning, Maria. How are you and Diego settling in at the Morales' place?"
"Oh, you very well."
"Thank you. Actually, I'm hoping you might be able to help me with something," Maria replied, approaching the counter where Tom was organizing inventory records with the same methodical precision that seemed to characterize everything in this community. "Of course. What do you need?" "I'm starting some restoration work on the house. I've discovered that there are multiple layers of wallpaper that need to be removed carefully. We have supplies that would help me do that without damaging." "What's underneath?" Tom's expression shifted slightly, suggesting interest that went beyond simple customer service. "The Morales house has a lot of history in those walls. Esperanza was always very particular about maintaining things properly." "What kind of condition are the walls in underneath the paper?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. There seems to be writing or documentation under some of the layers, and I want to preserve whatever might be historically important." "Writing under the wallpaper?" Tom asked, his tone becoming more focused. "That's interesting. Esperanza never mentioned anything like that, but she was always very private about the house's history." Maria chose her words carefully. It's uncertain about how much information to share until she better understood what they had discovered. "It looks like record-keeping of some kind. Dates and names, possibly financial information. I'm hoping to preserve it while I restore the room." Tom nodded thoughtfully before walking toward the section of the store that contained painting and wallpaper supplies. "You'll want a steamer for the wallpaper removal, and probably some archival quality materials if you're trying to preserve documents. Let me get you set up with everything you'll need." As Tom assembled supplies, he continued the conversation in a way that suggested he knew more about the Morales property than he had initially indicated. Esperanza was always very interested in local history. She used to come in here asking questions about families who had lived in the area during the 1940s and 1950s. Said she was researching genealogy, but she seemed more interested in events than people, if you know what I mean. "What kind of events?" "Oh, agricultural programs, government assistance during the Depression and war years, that sort of thing. Millfield was part of several federal programs during and after World War II crop subsidies, rural electrification, soil conservation projects." Esperanza seemed to know more about those programs than most people who actually participated in them. The information suggested that Esperanza's hidden records might be connected to federal agricultural programs, which could explain the systematic nature of the documentation Maria had glimpsed. But it didn't explain why such records would need to be hidden or why they would be preserved with such elaborate secrecy. "Did she ever mention why she was so interested in those particular programs?" Maria asked. Tom hesitated in a way that suggested he was weighing how much information to share with someone who was still relatively new to the community. She always said that official records didn't tell the whole story about what really happened in rural communities during the war years. Said there were things that people needed to know about how federal programs actually worked, but that most of the evidence had been buried or destroyed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Mike Sullivan, a man in his 50s whose presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the store from casual friendliness to something more formal and cautious. Sullivan had the bearing of someone who took his responsibilities seriously and maintained professional relationships with everyone in his jurisdiction, regardless of personal feelings. "Morning, Tom." Ms. Gonzalez, Sullivan said with polite formality. How are you folks doing today? Fine, Sheriff. Just helping Maria with some supplies for house restoration. Tom replied, his tone becoming noticeably more neutral. The Morales place has needed attention for a while. How are you finding rural life, Miss Gonzalez? It's been wonderful for both Diego and me, Maria replied honestly. Everyone has been very welcoming, and Diego's health has improved dramatically since we moved here. Glad to hear it. Rural. Iowa is a good place to raise children, Sullivan said, then paused in a way that suggested he had more specific reasons for the conversation. I actually wanted to mention that if you discover anything unusual while you're working on the household documents, artifacts, anything that might be historically significant, you should probably let me know. Sometimes old properties contain items that should be handled through official channels. The warning was politely phrased but clearly intentional. And Maria felt a chill of recognition that law enforcement was already aware of the possibility that her restoration work might uncover something significant. What kind of things should I be concerned about? Oh, just general precautions. Sometimes old farmhouses contain documents related to federal programs or business activities that might have legal implications even decades later. Better to be safe and have everything reviewed properly. Tom's expression had become carefully neutral during Sullivan's comments, and Maria sensed that there were undercurrents in this conversation that she didn't fully understand. The sheriff's interest in her restoration work seemed too specific to be casual, and his knowledge of potential document discoveries suggested that other people in Millfield knew more about the Morales property than they had initially indicated. I'll certainly keep that in mind, Sheriff, Maria replied diplomatically. Right now, I'm just trying to remove old wallpaper without damaging the walls underneath. Good approach. I'll let you folks get back to business. Tom, give my regards to your mother, Ms. Gonzalez. Welcome to Millfield. After Sullivan left, Tom completed Maria's order with efficient professionalism. But the easy conversation of earlier had been replaced by something more guarded. As he loaded supplies into her truck, he offered a piece of advice that sounded carefully considered. Maria Esperanza was a good woman who cared deeply about this community and its history. Whatever she left behind, she had good reasons for preserving it the way she did. Just remember that not everyone in town necessarily agrees about how much of the past should be dug up and examined. The warning was subtle but clear. Maria's restoration work was being watched by people who had opinions about what she might discover. And those opinions might not all be supportive of historical truth-telling. Back at the farmhouse, Maria spent the afternoon carefully removing wallpaper from the living room wall. Using the steamer Tom had provided to soften adhesive without damaging the hidden writing underneath, the process was slow and meticulous, but it revealed increasingly detailed documentation that confirmed her suspicions about the systematic nature of Esperanza's record-keeping. The hidden writing included names, dates, and financial figures that appeared to document agricultural assistance programs during and after World War II. But as Maria uncovered more of the wall, she discovered that the records went far beyond simple program participation. There were references to irregular distributions, unreported deliveries, and alternative arrangements that suggested activities outside normal program guidelines. Most concerning were references to specific individuals, farmers, government officials, and business people, along with notations that suggested some kind of systematic fraud or manipulation of federal agricultural programs. The careful preservation of this information, combined with the elaborate concealment methods, suggested that Esperanza had been documenting criminal activity that could still have legal implications decades later. When Diego returned from his school field trip, he was full of enthusiasm about corn mazes and harvest festivals. But he immediately noticed Maria's preoccupation with their ongoing discovery. "Mom, did you find more secret writing today?" he asked. Settling beside her on the floor, she was carefully documenting each section of revealed text with photographs before continuing the wallpaper removal. "Yes, sweetheart. A lot more writing, and it seems to be about important things that happened in this area a long time ago." "What kind of important things?" Maria considered how to explain her growing suspicions about government program fraud. Without frightening Diego or involving him in adult concerns that might become dangerous, it looks like great-great-aunt Esperanza was keeping records about how the government helped farmers during hard times. But some of the help might not have been given fairly to everyone who needed it. You mean some people cheated? It's possible. And if they did cheat, then Esperanza's records might be the only proof that it happened. Diego studied the careful rows of handwriting that Maria had revealed, trying to understand why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to preserve information about events that had happened before their parents were born. Mom, if people did bad things a long time ago, why would it matter now? Because sometimes bad things don't just happen once. If people got away with cheating during the war, they might have kept cheating later. And if their children or other people learned about the cheating but didn't stop it, then the bad things might still be happening. So great-great-aunt Esperanza was like a detective, keeping evidence in case someone honest needed to prove what really happened. That's exactly right, Diego. She was preserving evidence. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the front door, an unusual occurrence in rural areas where neighbors typically called ahead unless there was an emergency. Maria looked through the window to see a woman in her 40s wearing business attire that was clearly not designed for farmhouse visits. Ms. Gonzalez. "I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University of Iowa's History Department," the woman said when Maria opened the door. "I received a call from Tom Henderson, suggesting that you might have discovered some historically significant materials during your house restoration." Maria felt immediately suspicious of the timing and the chain of communication that had brought an academic researcher to her door within hours of her conversation at the hardware store. What kind of materials would be historically significant? Records related to federal agricultural programs during the 1940s and 1950s. There's been ongoing scholarly interest in how those programs were actually implemented at the local level, particularly in communities that don't have complete official documentation. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Maria was beginning to understand that her discoveries were attracting attention from multiple directions. She wasn't certain which of those interests were aligned with her own goals of understanding. Esperanza's legacy. "Not sure what I found yet," Maria replied, carefully. "I'm still in the early stages of restoration work, of course. I don't want to interfere with your project. But if you do discover documents that might have historical value, the university has resources for proper preservation and analysis. We could help ensure that important historical information is preserved and made available to researchers." What would that process involve? Typically, we would photograph or digitize materials for our archives while returning originals to the property owner. The goal is scholarly access without compromising private ownership rights. Diego appeared beside Maria, studying Dr. Walsh with the frank curiosity that children applied to adults whose motivations weren't immediately clear. "Are you here about the secret writing that great-great-aunt Esperanza hid in the walls?" Asked with characteristic directness. Dr. Walsh's expression sharpened with obvious interest. "Secret writing? Can you tell me more about what you found?" Maria felt protective of both Diego's innocence and their family's privacy in the face of what was clearly professional interests that might not prioritize their well-being. "Diego, why don't you work on your homework while Dr. Walsh and I finish talking?" "Actually, I'd love to hear Diego's perspective," Dr. Walsh said, crouching to Diego's eye level with a kind of practiced friendliness that suggested experience working with children. "Sometimes kids notice things that adults miss." "What did the secret writing look like?" "Like lists of names and numbers, but hidden under the flower wallpaper so nobody could see it unless they took the paper off," Diego replied enthusiastically. "Mom thinks great-great-aunt Esperanza was keeping evidence about people who did bad things during the war." "Evidence of bad things? That sounds very interesting. What kind of bad things?" Maria intervened before Diego could provide more details. "About their ongoing discoveries?" "Dr. Walsh, I appreciate your interest, but I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I can make decisions about sharing information with researchers. Of course, here's my card with my contact information. Please don't hesitate to call if you have questions about historical preservation, or if you'd like to discuss the scholarly value of what you're discovering." After Dr. Walsh left, Maria felt increasingly uncomfortable about the rapid attention their discoveries were receiving. The sheriff's warning about official channels. Tom Henderson's conversation about Esperanza's historical research, now an academic researcher appearing within hours of her hardware. Store visit suggested that people in Millfield had been anticipating her discoveries and preparing responses to whatever she might find. That evening, as Diego worked on homework at the kitchen table, Maria called the law firm that had handled Esperanza's estate, hoping to get more information about her great-aunt's intentions and any guidance she might have left about handling the house's hidden contents. Attorney James Morrison was working late and took her call immediately, suggesting that he had been expecting contact about issues beyond simple property inheritance. "Miss Gonzalez, how are you settling in at the Morales property?" he asked with professional warmth that seemed to carry undertones of concern. "Very well, thank you. But I'm calling because I've discovered some unusual things during house restoration that I think Esperanza might have wanted me to find." "What kind of unusual things?" "Historical documents hidden under wallpaper? Records that appear to document federal agricultural programs from the 1940s and 1950s? But with information that suggests irregularities or possibly fraudulent activities." There was a pause before Morrison responded, and Maria could hear papers being moved in the background, suggesting that he was consulting specific files related to her inheritance. "Ms. Gonzalez Esperanza left a sealed letter with specific instructions that it should be given to you if you discovered what she called the wall archives. I think this conversation indicates that you found what she was referring to." "Knew I would find hidden documents?" "She was quite certain that you would have both the curiosity and the courage to uncover the full extent of your inheritance. The sealed letter contains instructions about how she wanted you to handle what you discovered, including contact information for people she trusted to help you understand the historical and legal significance of the materials. Can you send me that letter?" "I can do better than that. I'll drive out to Millfield tomorrow morning to deliver it personally and discuss the implications with you directly." Esperanza was very specific that this information should be handled carefully and that you should have proper legal guidance before making decisions about what to do with the evidence. "Evidence? You're calling it evidence, not just historical documents." Ms. Gonzalez Esperanza spent over 30 years documenting activities that she believed constituted systematic fraud against federal agricultural programs. The materials you're discovering represent her life's work in preserving proof of criminal activities that were never prosecuted because the evidence was hidden or destroyed. She trusted you to ensure that her documentation would finally reach people who could pursue justice. Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she began to understand the true scope of Esperanza's inheritance. Hadn't just inherited a farmhouse, she had inherited a mission to expose criminal activities that had been covered up for decades. "Mr. Morrison, are there people who would prefer that this evidence never came to light?" "Yes, Ms. Gonzalez. There are definitely people who would prefer that Esperanza's work remained buried with her. Some of those people are still alive, still influential, and still committed to protecting reputations and legacies that could be destroyed by what you're uncovering. How dangerous is this for Diego and me? That depends on how you choose to handle the information and who you decide to trust with it." Esperanza's letter contains guidance about those decisions, including contact information for people who can help protect you while ensuring that the truth finally comes to light. After ending the call, Maria sat in Esperanza's kitchen looking out at the peaceful rural landscape that had seemed like a refuge from their previous struggles, but was now revealing itself as the center of a historical controversy that could affect their safety and future. Diego appeared beside her, having finished his homework, and noticed her preoccupation with adult concerns that seemed to be growing more complex each day. "Mom, are you worried about the secret writing and the people who want to see it?" "Little bit, sweetheart. It seems like Great-Great Esperanza left us something very important, but also something that might make some people unhappy, because they don't want everyone to know about the bad things that happened." "Exactly." Diego considered this with the kind of moral clarity that children often brought to complicated adult situations. "But if Great-Great Esperanza's saved, the evidence for us, that means she thought we would be brave enough to make sure the truth came out, right?" "Yes, I think that's exactly what she thought." "Then we should be brave enough to do what she hoped we would do, even if it makes some people mad." Maria hugged her son, amazed by his ability to cut through complexity and fear to identify the essential moral question at the heart of their situation. Esperanza had indeed chosen them because she believed they would have the courage to pursue truth over comfort, justice over safety. As night fell over the farmhouse where Esperanza had spent decades preserving evidence of systematic fraud, Maria prepared for whatever challenges the next day would bring. Attorney Morrison's visit would provide guidance about how to handle their discoveries responsibly. But Maria was already beginning to understand that their simple plan for a quiet, rural life had evolved into something far more significant and potentially dangerous. The hidden records in Esperanza's walls contained proof of criminal activities that powerful people had spent decades covering up, and Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had moved to Iowa seeking only stability for her son, was about to become the guardian of evidence that could finally bring justice for crimes that had been buried for over 70 years. The story was accelerating toward a confrontation between truth and power, and Maria was beginning to understand how much courage she would need for what lay ahead. Attorney James Morrison arrived at the farmhouse precisely at 9 a.m., driving a silver sedan that looked out of place on the gravel lane but suggested the kind of professional success that came from handling complex legal matters with discretion and competence. He was a man in his early 60s with graying hair and the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades managing sensitive information for clients who required absolute confidentiality. Maria had spent the night alternating between excitement and anxiety about what Esperanza's sealed letter might contain, while Diego had slept peacefully, apparently trusting that, whatever challenges emerged, the adults would handle them appropriately. His confidence in their ability to navigate complex situations continued to amaze Maria, particularly given the uncertainty that had characterized so much of his young life. "Gonzalez, thank you for making time to meet with me," Morrison said as Maria welcomed him into Esperanza's living room, where the partially revealed wall writing provided immediate evidence of the discoveries that had prompted their conversation. "I see you've made significant progress in uncovering what Esperanza called her insurance policy." "Insurance policy?" That's how she referred to the documentation you're discovering. She believed that preserving evidence of systematic fraud was the only way to ensure that similar activities couldn't continue indefinitely without accountability.
Ow.
Morrison opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope that bore Esperanza's careful handwriting. "For Maria Gonzalez. Reveal their secrets." The formality of the inscription suggested that Esperanza had given considerable thought to this moment and the responsibility she was transferring to someone she had never met but had carefully chosen. "Before you read the letter," Morrison said, settling into one of Esperanza's comfortable chairs, "I need to explain the legal context of what you've inherited." Esperanza spent over 30 years documenting what she believed was systematic fraud involving federal agricultural programs, rural development initiatives, and disaster relief distributions during and after World War II. How did she get access to information about federal programs? Her late husband, Carlos Morales, worked for the Cedar County Agricultural Extension Office from 1943 until his death in 1987. His position gave him access to records about federal program implementation, participant eligibility, and fund distributions. What he discovered was a pattern of irregularities that suggested some local officials were manipulating programs for personal benefit. Maria felt a chill of recognition as she began to understand the scope of what Esperanza had preserved. Kind of irregularities? False participant applications? Inflated damage assessments for disaster relief? Diversion of agricultural subsidies to ineligible recipients? Systematic exclusion of minority farmers from programs they were legally entitled to access, Morrison explained, with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time reviewing the evidence. The pattern suggested coordination between local agricultural officials, county administrators, and certain prominent farming families. And Carlos documented this? Carlos began documenting irregularities in the mid-1940s, initially as part of his official responsibilities to ensure program compliance, but when he reported his findings to state and federal authorities, he was told to limit his investigations and focus on routine administrative duties. They told him to stop investigating fraud. They told him that his concerns were being reviewed through appropriate channels and that continued local investigation might interfere with ongoing federal oversight. The investigation never materialized, and the irregular activities continued. Morrison paused to allow Maria to process the implications before continuing with information that would explain Esperanza's decades of secretive record-keeping. Carlos began maintaining private documentation of activities that federal authorities seemed determined to ignore. When he died suddenly in 1987, Esperanza discovered his records and realized that she was the only person who possessed comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud that had enriched some families while impoverishing others. Why didn't she take the evidence to authorities herself? She tried. In 1988, she contacted the FBI field office in Cedar Rapids with a summary of Carlos's documentation. She was told that the statute of limitations had expired for most of the activities, that proving intent would be difficult after so many years, and that pursuing investigations would be expensive and unlikely to result in prosecutions. So she decided to preserve the evidence for someone else to find. She decided to continue Carlos's work by expanding the documentation to include ongoing activities that suggested the same families and officials were still manipulating federal programs. She spent 30 years creating what amounts to a comprehensive case file for fraud prosecutions. Morrison handed Maria the sealed envelope, but continued his explanation before she opened it. Ms. Gonzalez, the people involved in the activities that Carlos and Esperanza documented include some of the most prominent families in Cedar County. Their children and grandchildren now hold positions in local government, banking, and agricultural business. The evidence you're uncovering could destroy reputations and trigger criminal investigations that reach into current political and business leadership. Are you telling me this to discourage me from reading the letter? I'm telling you this so you understand the stakes before you make decisions about how to proceed. Esperanza believed that you would have the courage and integrity to ensure that the truth finally came to light, but she also wanted you to understand the risks involved. Maria opened the envelope, finding several pages written in Esperanza's careful script, along with a small key and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the farmhouse property. My dear Maria, the letter began, if you were reading this, then you have discovered the first layer of documentation that Carlos and I preserved for over 40 years. The wall archives in the living room contain only a portion of the evidence we accumulated. The key in this envelope opens a hidden storage area in the barn where we preserved original documents, photographs, and recorded statements that provide irrefutable proof of the criminal activities we documented. Maria looked up at Morrison, who was watching her reaction with professional interest tinged by personal concern. There's more evidence hidden in the barn? Considerably more. Esperanza was very thorough in her record-keeping, and she understood that proving systematic fraud would require evidence that met legal standards for prosecution. Maria continued reading the letter, which provided detailed instructions for accessing the hidden storage area, along with explanations of the evidence's organization and significance. The families involved in the fraud include the Hendersons, the Sullivans, the Crawfords, the Bishops' names that will be familiar to you as prominent members of the Millfield community. Their criminal activities began during the 1940s and continued through the 1970s, stealing federal assistance intended for struggling farmers and keeping minority families from accessing programs designed to help them achieve economic stability. The revelation that some of Millfield's most respected families were implicated in systematic fraud explained the undercurrents Maria had sensed in her interactions with community members. Sheriff Sullivan's warnings about official channels, Tom Henderson's knowledge of Esperanza's research, and the rapid appearance of Dr. Walsh all suggested that people in Millfield had been anticipating her discoveries and preparing responses. The current generation of these families may not have directly participated in the original fraud. The letter continued, but they have benefited from wealth that was stolen from their neighbors. And some continue to hold positions that allow them to suppress evidence of their family's criminal activities. You must be very careful about who you trust with this information. Maria felt a growing sense of isolation as she realized that many of the people who had welcomed her to Millfield might have reasons to oppose her uncovering of historical truth. The friendly community that had seemed like a refuge for her and Diego was revealing itself as a place where powerful families had spent decades. protecting secrets that could destroy their reputations and legacies. However, Esperanza's letter continued, "There are people you can trust to help you ensure that this evidence reaches appropriate authorities. Contact Professor Margaret Chen at the University of Iowa Law School. She specializes in civil rights violations and has been researching systematic exclusion of minority farmers from federal programs. Also contact Agent Rebecca Torres at the FBI field office in Cedar Rapids. She is investigating current agricultural fraud and will understand the historical significance of what Carlos and I documented." The letter concluded with personal reflections that brought tears to Maria's eyes as she understood the loneliness and determination that had characterized Esperanza's final decades. "Maria, I chose you as my heir because your grandmother Elena Morales was Carlos's cousin, making you family, even though we never had the opportunity to meet. More importantly, I researched your background and learned about your courage in raising Diego, despite difficult circumstances. Your integrity in your nursing career and your commitment to doing what is right, even when it requires personal sacrifice. I trust you to ensure that Carlos's work and my life's mission will finally achieve justice for the families who were robbed of opportunities they deserved." Morrison waited patiently as Maria finished reading, clearly familiar with the letters contents and prepared to discuss the legal implications of Esperanza's revelations. "Mr. Morrison, how dangerous is this for Diego and me?" Maria asked, feeling the weight of responsibility for protecting her son while honoring Esperanza's trust. "That depends on how you choose to proceed and how quickly the evidence reaches appropriate authorities," Morrison replied honestly. "The families implicated in Esperanza's documentation have significant resources and local influence. If they believe you're threatening their reputations or legal standing, they may attempt to intimidate you or suppress the evidence before it can be properly reviewed. But if I contact the people Esperanza recommended, Professor Chen and Agent Torres, then I'll have protection. You'll have legal support and federal oversight, which should provide significant protection. The key is ensuring that multiple copies of the evidence are in secure locations before anyone realizes the full scope of what you've discovered." Diego chose that moment to return from school, bursting through the front door with enthusiasm about his day and immediate curiosity about their adult visitor. "Mom, is this about the secret writing?" he asked with characteristic directness, studying Morrison with the frank assessment that children applied to adults whose presence in their lives required explanation. "Diego, this is Mr. Morrison, the lawyer who helped us inherit the farmhouse from great-great-aunt Esperanza," Maria explained. "He's helping us understand some important things about the house's history, like why she hid evidence in the walls." Morrison smiled at Diego's straightforward approach to complex adult situations. "Exactly like that, Diego. She wanted to make sure that information about unfair things that happened a long time ago would eventually reach people who could fix the problems." "What kind of unfair things?" Maria exchanged glances with Morrison, certain about how much information to share with Diego about criminal activities that might still pose risks to their safety. So people in positions of authority took money and opportunities that were supposed to help farmers who were struggling, Morrison explained carefully. Great-great-aunt Esperanza kept records to prove what really happened. And now Mom has to decide what to do with the evidence. That's right. Diego considered this information with the serious expression he used when processing adult complexities that affected their family's well-being. "Mr. Morrison, if Mom gives the evidence to good people who can use it to fix the problems, will that keep us safe?" "Should, Diego. The safest approach is usually to make sure the truth reaches people who can handle it properly." After Morrison left with promises to coordinate contact with Professor Chen and Agent Torres, Maria spent the afternoon following Esperanza's map to locate the hidden storage area in the barn. The key opened a carefully concealed panel in what appeared to be a standard storage cabinet, revealing a climate-controlled space that contained dozens of file boxes, photograph albums, and what appeared to be audio recording equipment. Scope of Carlos and Esperanza's documentation exceeded anything Maria had anticipated. Files were organized by year, program, and family, with cross-references that demonstrated systematic research spanning for decades. Photographs showed meetings between local officials and federal program administrators. Documents proved false applications and fraudulent damage assessments. And recorded interviews with elderly farmers described first-hand experiences of discrimination and program manipulation. "Mom, this is like a detective's office," Diego observed, studying the organized evidence with fascination rather than fear. Esperanza and great-great-uncle, Carlos, were like detectives collecting proof about crimes. "That's exactly what they were doing," Maria replied, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of protecting and utilizing such comprehensive evidence. They spent most of their adult lives making sure the truth would be preserved. And now, we have to make sure the truth gets to people who can use it to help the families who were hurt by the bad things. That's our responsibility now. Their exploration of the hidden archives was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Sullivan. His presence at the farmhouse carried a different energy than his previous casual visit to Henderson's Hardware. He emerged from his patrol car with the purposeful movement of someone conducting official business rather than making social calls. "Afternoon, Miss Gonzalez," Sullivan said, as Maria met him in the farmyard, deliberately positioning herself between the sheriff and the barn where she and Diego had been examining Esperanza's archives. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about historical documents and proper handling procedures." "What kind of follow-up?" Maria asked, noting that Sullivan's tone was more formal than their previous interactions, and that he seemed to be assessing the property for signs of unusual activity. "I've received reports that you've been in contact with outside researchers about materials you've discovered during house restoration. I wanted to make sure you understand the importance of working through proper local channels before involving state or federal authorities in historical preservation matters." The warning was clearly directed at her conversation with Dr. Walsh. But the speed with which Sullivan had learned about academic interest in her discoveries suggested that someone was monitoring her activities closely. "Sheriff, I'm just trying to understand what Great-Aunt Esperanza left behind and handle it appropriately," Maria replied carefully. "Of course, but it's important to understand that some historical materials might be related to ongoing legal matters or might affect current residents who have privacy rights that need to be protected." Diego appeared beside Maria, studying Sheriff Sullivan with the curious attention he paid to adults whose behavior didn't match their stated intentions. "Sheriff Sullivan, are you worried that Mom found evidence about crimes that some people don't want anyone to know about?" Diego asked with the directness that continued to surprise adults who expected children to avoid uncomfortable topics. Sullivan's expression tightened slightly at Diego's perceptive question. "Diego, sometimes old documents can be misunderstood or taken out of context in ways that might hurt innocent people unfairly. But if the documents prove that crimes really happened, then the people aren't innocent, are they? It's complicated, son. Adult situations usually are." Maria felt protective of Diego's moral clarity in the face of adult efforts to obscure truth with complexity and nuance. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern about proper procedures. I'm working with legal counsel to ensure that anything historically significant is handled appropriately." "What kind of legal counsel?" The attorney who handled Esperanza's estate is guiding me through the process. Sullivan nodded, but his expression suggested that Morrison's involvement was not necessarily reassuring from his perspective. "Ms. Gonzalez, I hope you'll remember that Millfield is a small community where people have lived and worked together for generations. Sometimes stirring up old controversies can damage relationships and community harmony in ways that don't serve anyone's best interests. Sometimes protecting community harmony means allowing injustice to continue," Maria replied, feeling her own courage strengthen in response to pressure that seemed designed to discourage her from pursuing truth. "Just remember that you and Diego are new here, and your future in this community depends on maintaining good relationships with your neighbors." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Maria felt cold certainty that Sheriff Sullivan was representing interests that extended beyond simple law enforcement concerns about proper procedures. After Sullivan left, Maria called Attorney Morrison to report the sheriff's visit and her growing concerns about local opposition to her investigation of Esperanza's evidence. "Morrison here," the attorney answered immediately, suggesting that he had been expecting her call. "Mr. Morrison, Sheriff Sullivan just visited with what sounded like warnings about not stirring up old controversies." I think people in Millfield know more about what I've discovered than I initially realized. That's not surprising. The families implicated in Esperanza's documentation have had decades to develop networks and influence that protect their interests. The fact that you're receiving official warnings suggests they're taking your discoveries seriously. What should I do? Follow Esperanza's recommendations immediately. Contact Professor Chen and Agent Torres as soon as possible, and be prepared to provide them with copies of the evidence before local pressure escalates further. How quickly can that happen? I'll make the initial contacts today and arrange for secure evidence transfer within 48 hours. The key is ensuring that federal authorities have the documentation before anyone can claim jurisdiction or demand that you turn materials over to local officials. Is Diego safe? As long as the evidence remains secure and you have federal protection, yes. But Maria, you need to understand that you're now in possession of evidence that could trigger criminal investigations reaching into current political and business leadership. Stakes are high enough that some people might be willing to take significant risks to suppress the information. That evening, as Maria and Diego sat in Esperanza's kitchen reviewing their day, while Diego managed his evening insulin routine, Maria tried to explain their situation without frightening him unnecessarily. Diego, we're going to have some visitors in the next few days, people who study history and people from the government who investigate crimes. They're going to want to see the evidence that Great Esperanza preserved, the good people. Who can use the evidence to fix the problems? It's the good people. But there might also be some people who don't want the evidence to be seen by anyone, and they might try to pressure us or make things difficult. Diego considered this information while testing his blood glucose levels with the competent efficiency that had become second nature despite his young age.
Mom, are you scared about the people who don't want the truth to come out? A little bit, Maria admitted. But I'm more determined than scared.
Great and Esperanza trusted us with something very important, and we're going to make sure we handle it the right way. Even if it makes some people mad at us. Diego nodded with satisfaction, apparently reassured by Maria's commitment to doing what Esperanza had hoped they would do. Mom, I think great Aunt Esperanza chose us because she knew we would be brave enough to help the families who were hurt by the bad things. Even if helping them means some other people get in trouble for what they did. I think you're absolutely right, sweetheart. As night fell over the farmhouse, where Carlos and Esperanza had spent decades, out documenting systematic fraud and waiting for the right people to ensure that justice would finally be served, Maria prepared for what she now understood would be a confrontation between truth and power that could affect not just historical understanding, but current criminal prosecutions and civil rights enforcement. The evidence hidden in Esperanza's walls and barn represented proof of crimes that had enriched some families while impoverishing others. And Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had moved to Iowa seeking only stability for her son, was about to become the guardian of documentation that could finally bring accountability for systematic fraud that had been covered up for over 70 years. The story was approaching its most dangerous phase, as federal authorities prepared to review evidence that could trigger investigations, reaching into the highest levels of Cedar County's political and business establishment, while local interests organized to suppress information that threatened reputations and legacies built on criminal foundations. Maria had already contacted the people Esperanza had recommended for help. But she was about to discover that ensuring justice would require more courage than she had ever needed before, and that protecting Diego while honoring Esperanza's trust would test every resource she possessed. The confrontation between truth and power was about to begin, and Maria was running out of time to prepare for challenges she was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought an autumn thunderstorm that rattled the farmhouse windows and turned the gravel driveway into a muddy obstacle course. But Maria was too focused on the approaching federal investigation to pay attention to weather complications. Professor Margaret Chen from the University of Iowa Law School had called at 6 a.m. to confirm that she would arrive by noon with a team of civil rights researchers, while FBI agent Rebecca Torres had scheduled a 2 p.m. meeting to begin formal review of Esperanza's evidence. Diego had slept restlessly, his dreams apparently troubled by adult conversations about criminal investigations and community pressure. that were too complex for a 6-year-old to fully process. His morning blood glucose readings were slightly elevated, reflecting the stress that he was absorbing despite Maria's efforts to shield him from the most concerning aspects of their situation. "Mom, are the government people coming today to see great-great-aunt Esperanza's evidence?" he asked over breakfast, spooning cereal while watching rain streak down the kitchen windows. "Yes, sweetheart. Professor Chen studies how people were treated unfairly because of their race or background, and Agent Torres investigates crimes involving government programs. They're going to help us make sure the evidence is used properly. Will they be able to arrest the people who did bad things? Some of the people who did the original bad things are probably too old or have died already," Maria explained carefully. "But if any crimes are still continuing, or if people helped cover up the old crimes, then there might be consequences for those actions." "What kind of consequences?" "People might have to give back money they stole, or face legal punishment, or lose jobs where they have responsibility for preventing the same kinds of problems." Diego nodded thoughtfully while testing his morning blood glucose with the methodical efficiency that had become routine despite his young age. "So even if we can't punish everyone who did bad things, we can still help make sure the bad things don't keep happening to other families." "That's exactly right. And we can make sure that people know the truth about what really happened. So the families who were hurt get recognition that they deserved help they never received." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a convoy of vehicles that navigated the muddy driveway with evident difficulty. Professor Chen had brought a team of 3 graduate students and a professional archivist, all equipped with photography equipment, portable scanners, and waterproof cases for document protection. Their preparation suggested experience with similar investigations and understanding of the evidential requirements for civil rights cases. Professor Margaret Chen was a woman in her 40s, with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years fighting institutional injustice through meticulous legal research and advocacy. She emerged from the lead vehicle wearing practical clothing suitable for farmhouse investigation, but carrying herself with the professional authority that came from successful courtroom experience and academic recognition. Gonzalez, thank you for contacting me about this discovery, Professor Chen said as Maria welcomed the team into Esperanza's living room. "Based on my conversation with Attorney Morrison, what you found could provide crucial evidence for ongoing civil rights cases involving systematic exclusion of minority farmers from federal programs. How does evidence from the 1940s and 1950s relate to current cases? Because the same families and institutions often maintained discriminatory practices across multiple generations. And because federal agricultural programs have continued to exclude minority participants in ways that follow historical patterns. If we can prove that exclusion was systematic and intentional from the beginning, it strengthens current cases for compensation and policy reform." Diego appeared beside Maria, studying the research team with curious interest rather than fear. "Professor Chen, will great-great-aunt Esperanza's evidence help families who are still being treated unfairly today?" Professor Chen smiled at Diego's direct question and crouched to his eye level with the kind of respectful attention that suggested experience working with children affected by civil rights issues. "Yes, Diego. Sometimes proving that unfair treatment has been happening for a long time helps courts understand that current unfair treatment isn't accidental. It's part of a pattern that needs to be stopped. So the evidence can help both the families who were hurt a long time ago and families who are being hurt now?" "That's exactly right." As Professor Chen's team began systematically photographing and cataloging the wall writings in the living room, Maria led them to the barn where Esperanza's more comprehensive archives awaited federal review. The hidden storage area impressed even experienced civil rights researchers with its organization and scope. "This is extraordinary," said Dr. James Liu, the professional archivist who had accompanied Professor Chen's team. "I've never seen such comprehensive documentation of systematic program manipulation preserved by private individuals. The level of detail and cross-referencing suggests professional training in evidence collection." Esperanza's husband Carlos worked for the Agricultural Extension Office, Maria explained. He had access to official program records and understood how to document irregularities in ways that would meet legal standards. It shows. Look at this. Dr. Liu held up a file containing photographs of meetings between local officials and federal program administrators, accompanied by detailed notes about discussions of eligibility criteria and fund distributions. These photos were taken covertly, probably with equipment that was sophisticated for the 1940s and 1950s. Someone invested considerable resources in this documentation project. Professor Chen examined financial records that showed systematic diversion of federal assistance from qualified minority farmers to white families who didn't meet program criteria. The pattern is unmistakable. Eligible Hispanic and black farmers were rejected for assistance, while white families with questionable claims received multiple payments. The discrimination wasn't subtle, it was blatant and systematic. What can be done about it now? Maria asked. Several things. First, we can use this evidence to support current discrimination cases involving federal agricultural programs. Second, we can seek compensation for families who were illegally excluded from assistance they deserved. Third, we can demand policy reforms that prevent similar discrimination in current programs. The documentation process was interrupted by the arrival of FBI agent Rebecca Torres, whose official vehicle and federal credentials immediately shifted the investigation from academic research to criminal law enforcement. Agent Torres was a woman in her mid-30s with the professional bearing of someone who had investigated complex white-collar crimes and understood the political implications of cases involving systematic fraud. Professor Chen, Ms. Gonzalez, Agent Torres said as she joined the group in the barn. I've reviewed the preliminary information Attorney Morrison provided, and what you've discovered appears to document criminal violations that fall under federal jurisdiction for investigation and potential prosecution. What kinds of criminal violations? Maria asked. Fraud against federal programs, conspiracy to defraud the government, civil rights violations, and possibly ongoing criminal enterprise if any of the documented activities have continued into recent years, Agent Torres replied, studying the organized evidence with obvious professional interest. Agent Torres, Diego said with characteristic directness. Can you arrest people who stole money that was supposed to help families who needed it? Agent Torres smiled at Diego's straightforward approach to complex legal questions. If we can prove that people committed crimes, then yes, we can pursue criminal charges even if the crimes happened a long time ago. Some kinds of fraud don't have time limits for prosecution. What about people who helped hide the crimes? That's called obstruction of justice, and it's also a crime that can be prosecuted. Professor Chen and Agent Torres spent the next 2 hours reviewing Esperanza's archives while Maria and Diego waited in the farmhouse, trying to process the magnitude of federal attention their discoveries had attracted. The presence of both academic researchers and criminal investigators confirmed that Esperanza's documentation would trigger multiple types of legal action, each with different implications for the families involved and the community where they had built their new life. Their wait was interrupted by an unexpected visitor whose arrival suggested that local opposition to their federal contacts was escalating beyond Sheriff Sullivan's unofficial warnings. Tom Henderson emerged from his pickup truck carrying what appeared to be official documentation, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by the formal bearing of someone conducting unpleasant business. Maria, I need to talk with you about a legal matter, Tom said as she met him on the front porch, deliberately positioning himself where the federal investigators in the barn could observe their conversation. What kind of legal matter? Cedar County Historical Society has filed a claim asserting ownership rights to historical documents discovered on the Morales property. They're arguing that materials related to federal programs belong in public archives rather than private possession. Maria felt cold certainty that the Historical Society's claim was coordinated with other efforts to prevent federal review of Esperanza's evidence. Tom, the documents were hidden in a house that Esperanza legally owned and legally bequeathed to me. How can anyone else claim ownership? The argument is that documents related to government programs are public records that were illegally removed from official custody. The Society is requesting temporary possession pending legal review of ownership rights. Who initiated this claim? Tom hesitated before answering, suggesting that he was uncomfortable with his role in delivering information that he knew was designed to obstruct justice. The request came from several prominent families who have historical connections to the documented programs and want to ensure that family privacy rights are protected during any review process. The families who are implicated in the fraud want to control access to evidence of their criminal activities? Maria, it's not that simple. These are people who have lived in this community for generations, contributed to its development, and deserve consideration of their legitimate concerns about historical accuracy and context. Diego appeared in the doorway, studying Tom Henderson. With the frank assessment, he applied to adults whose behavior didn't match their usual character. Mr. Henderson, are some of the people who want to take the evidence away from us related to the people who did bad things that great-great-aunt Esperanza wrote about? Tom looked uncomfortable with Diego's perceptive question. Diego, it's complicated. Sometimes families have to deal with accusations about things their relatives did a long time ago, even when current family members weren't involved and don't deserve to be blamed for other people's actions. But if they try to hide evidence of crimes, doesn't that make them part of the crimes? Agent Torres chose that moment to emerge from the barn, her timing suggesting that she had been monitoring the conversation and was prepared to intervene in any attempts to interfere with federal investigation. Mr. Henderson, I'm FBI Agent Rebecca Torres, she announced with official authority that immediately changed the dynamics of the conversation. I understand there are local claims regarding evidence that's currently under federal investigation. I need to inform you that interfering with a federal investigation is a serious crime, and any attempts to remove or control access to evidence could result in criminal charges. Tom's expression shifted from uncomfortable formality to genuine concern as he realized that local pressure tactics were now confronting federal law enforcement authority. Agent Torres, the Historical Society is simply trying to ensure that important local documents receive proper care in historical context. Mr. Henderson, the documents in question are evidence in a federal criminal investigation. They will remain in federal custody until that investigation is complete. Any interference with federal evidence collection will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What kind of federal criminal investigation? Systematic fraud against federal programs, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to defraud the government. The evidence suggests ongoing criminal enterprise that may extend into current activities. The revelation that federal authorities were treating Brands' documentation as evidence of ongoing criminal activity clearly surprised Tom, whose expression suggested that local opposition had underestimated the seriousness of federal interest in the case. Agent Torres, I think there may be misunderstandings about the nature of the historical activities that are documented. This is a small community where people have worked together for generations, and what might look like irregularities could simply reflect informal cooperation and mutual assistance during difficult times. Mr. Henderson, systematic exclusion of minority farmers from federal assistance programs while providing illegal benefits to ineligible white families isn't informal cooperation. It's criminal conspiracy and civil rights violations. The evidence is comprehensive and detailed enough to support prosecutions. After Tom left with obvious reluctance to report federal resistance to local control efforts, Agent Torres returned to the barn to complete her evidence review while Maria tried to understand how quickly their situation had escalated from historical curiosity to federal criminal investigation with local opposition that might threaten their safety. Professor Chen emerged from the barn carrying preliminary documentation that would be used to support civil rights cases while Agent Torres continued cataloging evidence for criminal prosecution. Maria, what we found exceeds our most optimistic expectations for this type of historical research, Professor Chen reported. Esperanza and Carlos documented systematic discrimination that affected hundreds of families over multiple decades. The evidence is strong enough to support both individual compensation claims and policy reform litigation. What does that mean for the families who were affected? It means they may finally receive recognition and compensation for assistance they were illegally denied. Some of the affected families are still in the area, still struggling with the economic consequences of discrimination they experienced decades ago. And what does it mean for us? It means you've provided crucial evidence for some of the most important civil rights cases in recent agricultural history. Your courage in preserving and sharing this documentation will help achieve justice that has been delayed for over 70 years. Agent Torres joined their conversation with information about the criminal investigation that would proceed parallel to civil rights litigation. Ms. Gonzalez, the criminal aspects of this case are equally significant, Agent Torres reported. The evidence suggests systematic fraud that may have continued beyond the activities that Carlos and Esperanza originally documented. We'll be investigating current officials and business leaders who may have knowledge of or involvement in ongoing criminal activities. How dangerous does that make our situation? It makes your situation serious enough that I'm recommending federal witness protection protocols until the investigation reaches a point where local interference becomes unlikely. What kind of witness protection? Relocation to a secure location with federal security oversight, at least temporarily. The people implicated in this evidence have significant local influence and strong motivations to prevent federal prosecution. Maria felt overwhelmed by the rapid escalation from simple house restoration to federal witness protection. But she also understood that Esperanza's legacy required courage that matched the risks involved in pursuing justice. Agent Torres, how long would witness protection last? That depends on how quickly we can secure the evidence, complete initial arrests, and neutralize threats to witnesses. Probably several weeks to a few months. What about Diego's school, his medical care, our life here? Those are legitimate concerns that we'll address through appropriate federal programs. Diego's medical needs can be managed through federal medical facilities, and his education can continue through distance learning programs until it's safe for you to return to normal life. Diego had been listening to the adult conversation with growing understanding of how dramatically their circumstances were changing. Dom, he said quietly, if we have to go away for a while to stay safe, that's okay. Great-Great and Esperanza waited 70 years for the right people to make sure the truth came out. We can be brave enough to do whatever it takes to finish what she started. Maria hugged her son, amazed by his ability to maintain moral clarity and courage in the face of disruptions that would challenge most adults. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of adventure, sweetheart? I'm sure. Besides, when we come back, maybe the bad people will be gone, and the families who were hurt will finally get the help they deserved. As the evening approached and the federal investigation team prepared to transport Esperanza's evidence to secure facilities for detailed analysis, Maria stood in the farmhouse where her Gredenhot had spent decades preserving proof of systematic injustice. Understanding that their simple plan for a quiet rural life had evolved into participation in one of the most significant civil rights cases in modern agricultural history. The documentation that Carlos and Esperanza had risked their safety to preserve was finally reaching federal authorities who could pursue justice for crimes that had been covered up for over 70 years. But achieving that justice would require Maria and Diego to accept federal protection while criminal investigations proceeded and civil rights litigation challenged institutional discrimination that continued to affect minority farmers. The story was entering its most dangerous and consequential phase. As federal authorities prepared to confront systematic fraud and discrimination that reached into the highest levels of Cedar County's political and business establishment, local interests organized to suppress evidence that threatened reputations and legacies built on criminal foundations. Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had inherited far more than a farmhouse, was about to become a federal witness in cases that could transform agricultural civil rights enforcement and bring accountability for systematic fraud that had enriched some families while impoverishing others for multiple generations. The confrontation between truth and power was about to reach its climax, and Maria was discovering that honoring Esperanza's trust would require more courage than she had ever imagined possible, but would also achieve justice that had been delayed for far too long. Tomorrow would bring federal witness protection and the beginning of criminal prosecutions that could finally hold powerful families accountable for decades of systematic fraud and discrimination, while civil rights litigation sought compensation and policy reforms that would prevent similar injustices in the future. The farmhouse where Esperanza had waited so patiently for the right people to ensure that her husband's documentation would reach the world had finally fulfilled its purpose, and Maria and Diego were about to discover whether American justice systems could still hold the powerful accountable when ordinary people possess the courage to demand truth over convenience, justice over comfort, and accountability over institutional protection of those who had betrayed the public trust. 3 months later, Maria stood in the witness box of the Federal District Court in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, her hand raised as she swore to tell the truth about discoveries that had transformed her understanding of justice, courage, and the power of ordinary people to hold institutions accountable for systematic crimes. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and community members whose lives had been affected by decades of agricultural fraud and discrimination that was finally facing federal prosecution. Diego sat in the front row beside Attorney Morrison, his presence a reminder that the pursuit of historical truth often required families to sacrifice comfort and safety for principles that extended far beyond personal benefit. His health had remained stable throughout their 3 months in federal witness protection, his asthma continuing to benefit from stress-free environments and excellent medical care provided through federal programs designed to protect witnesses who risked everything to testify against powerful criminal enterprises. The federal investigation that began with hidden wall writings in Esperanza's farmhouse had expanded into the largest agricultural fraud prosecution in Iowa history, involving 17 defendants, millions of dollars in stolen federal assistance, and systematic civil rights violations that had affected hundreds of minority farming families across multiple generations. The scope of criminal activity that Carlos and Esperanza had documented exceeded even federal investigators' expectations for white-collar crime in rural communities. Ms. Gonzalez, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, please tell the court how you discovered the evidence that led to this investigation. Maria looked out at the courtroom, seeing faces that represented 3 months of intensive preparation for testimony. It would help determine whether decades of systematic fraud would finally face accountability through American justice systems. My 6-year-old son and I inherited a farmhouse from my great-great-aunt Esperanza Morales, Maria began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing that her testimony was supported by comprehensive evidence and federal protection. While removing wallpaper during restoration work, we discovered writing hidden beneath multiple layers of decoration. The writing documented systematic fraud involving federal agricultural programs from the 1940s through the 1970s. What did this documentation reveal? It revealed that local officials, prominent farming families, and county administrators had systematically stolen federal assistance intended for struggling minority farmers while excluding qualified families from programs designed to help them achieve economic stability. How comprehensive was this documentation? Extremely comprehensive. My great-great-uncle Carlos Morales had worked for the Agricultural Extension Office and had access to official program records. When federal authorities ignored his reports of irregularities, he and Esperanza began maintaining private documentation that met legal standards for criminal prosecution. What was the scope of the criminal activities documented? The evidence showed that over 30 years, conspirators diverted millions of dollars in federal agricultural assistance, disaster relief, and rural development funds while systematically excluding Hispanic and black farmers from programs they were legally entitled to access. Attorney Martinez guided Maria through detailed testimony about the hidden archives in Esperanza's barn, the systematic organization of evidence spanning multiple decades, and the careful preservation methods that had maintained documentary proof of crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Ms. Gonzalez, what motivated you to contact federal authorities rather than handling this discovery through local channels? Esperanza left specific instructions that the evidence should reach people who could pursue justice without local interference. She had tried working through local authorities during her lifetime, and learned that many of the same families involved in the original fraud continued to hold positions that allowed them to suppress evidence of their criminal activities. Did you face pressure to avoid federal involvement? Yes. Local officials warned me about stirring up old controversies and suggested that I should work through local channels that would protect community harmony. But community harmony that depends on covering up systematic fraud isn't real harmony, it's institutional protection of criminal activity. Diego smiled at Maria's confident articulation of principles that had guided their decisions throughout the federal investigation. His moral clarity about helping families who had been hurt by criminal activities had provided steady guidance when adult complexities threatened to obscure fundamental questions of right and wrong. Defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray Maria as an outsider who had misunderstood local traditions and informal cooperation that characterized rural communities during difficult historical periods. Ms. Gonzalez, isn't it possible that what you interpreted as systematic fraud was actually informal mutual assistance between neighbors who were all struggling with the same economic challenges? No, Maria replied firmly. Systematic exclusion of minority farmers from federal assistance while providing illegal benefits to white families who didn't meet program criteria isn't mutual assistance, it's criminal conspiracy and civil rights violations. The evidence is too detailed and comprehensive to be misunderstood. But you had no personal knowledge of the historical context or the relationships between families who had lived in Cedar County for generations. I had comprehensive documentation created by people who did have personal knowledge and professional expertise. Carlos Morales worked for the Agricultural Extension Office for over 40 years. He understood federal program requirements and documented systematic violations that federal authorities should have prosecuted but chose to ignore. Isn't it possible that your interpretation of this documentation was influenced by contemporary political perspectives that weren't relevant to historical realities? The documentation speaks for itself. Photographs of meetings, copied official documents, recorded interviews with affected farmers, and financial records that prove systematic diversion of federal funds. Contemporary political perspectives don't change mathematical evidence of stolen money and excluded families. The prosecution's case included testimony from elderly, minority farmers who had been illegally excluded from federal assistance, federal investigators who confirmed the criminal nature of documented activities, and civil rights experts who explained how systematic discrimination had affected entire communities across multiple generations. Most powerful was testimony from Rosa Martinez, no relation to the prosecutor, an 89-year-old Hispanic woman whose family had been denied disaster relief after floods destroyed their crops in 1952, while white neighbors with less damage received full compensation plus additional assistance they weren't entitled to claim. We lost everything, Rosa testified with a voice that carried 7 decades of anger about injustice that had never been acknowledged. Our crops, our equipment, our savings. We applied for the same assistance our neighbors received, but officials told us our damage wasn't severe enough to qualify. Later, we learned that families with half our losses received payments that helped them expand their operations while we lost our farm and had to move to town to find work.
Ow.
How did this affect your family's future? My children grew up in poverty. Instead of inheriting a family farm, my grandchildren never had the opportunities that should have been their birthright. The theft of federal assistance didn't just affect one season, it affected generations. What does this prosecution mean to you? It means that finally, after 70 years, someone is acknowledging that what happened to us was wrong. It means that my grandchildren will know that their family deserved better and that the people who stole our opportunities are finally being held accountable. The defense strategy focused on arguing that activities documented by Carlos and Esperanza reflected common practices during a different era, when federal program administration was less formal and local officials had broader discretion in determining eligibility and assistance levels. But the prosecution's evidence was too comprehensive and systematic to be dismissed as historical misunderstanding. Financial records proved mathematical fraud. Photographs documented secret meetings to coordinate illegal activities. Recorded interviews revealed conscious intent to exclude minority farmers while enriching white families who didn't meet program criteria. Most damning was evidence that some of the fraudulent activities had continued into recent decades, involving children and grandchildren of original conspirators who had used inherited wealth and political influence to maintain discriminatory practices in current federal agricultural programs. Federal investigators had discovered that several defendants continued to manipulate crop insurance programs, rural development grants, and disaster relief distributions using methods that directly paralleled the systematic fraud documented by Carlos and Esperanza. Decades earlier, The evidence shows that this wasn't historical discrimination that ended with changing social attitudes. Agent Torres testified during the prosecution's case. This was ongoing criminal enterprise that adapted its methods, but maintained its essential character across multiple generations. How do current activities relate to historical fraud? The same families use wealth stolen through historical fraud to gain political influence that allowed them to continue manipulating federal programs. The current generation benefited from criminal activities and used those benefits to commit additional crimes. What is the scope of ongoing criminal activities? Our investigation identified over $12 million in fraudulent claims and illegally diverted federal assistance between 2010 and 2023. The methods used directly paralleled historical fraud patterns documented by Carlos and Esperanza Morales. The trial's most dramatic moment came when former Cedar County Commissioner Robert Henderson, Tom's father, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, providing insider testimony about how prominent families had coordinated to suppress evidence of historical fraud while continuing similar activities. We all knew about the old activities, Henderson testified with obvious reluctance. Our fathers and grandfathers told us stories about how things worked during the war years and afterwards. When Esperanza started asking questions in the 1980s, family leaders decided that the past should stay buried. What steps were taken to suppress evidence? We monitored Esperanza's activities, discouraged local authorities from taking her seriously, and made sure that any official inquiries were handled by people who understood the importance of protecting family reputations. Did these efforts continue after Esperanza's death? When Maria Gonzalez inherited the property, we assumed the evidence would remain hidden or be dismissed as irrelevant historical material. When she contacted federal authorities, family leaders panicked and tried to claim ownership of the documents. Through the Historical Society, were you aware that attempting to control federal evidence was illegal? We thought we could handle it the way we'd handled local problems for decades, through influence and informal pressure. We didn't anticipate federal determination to pursue prosecution regardless of local opposition. The defense's closing arguments emphasized the historical context of documented activities and the unfairness of prosecuting elderly defendants for activities that reflected common practices during a different era with different social standards. But the prosecution's closing statement focused on the systematic nature of documented crimes, the ongoing benefits that defendants continued to receive from historical fraud, and the importance of finally providing justice for families who had been robbed of opportunities they deserved. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez concluded, this case isn't about judging historical activities by contemporary standards. This case is about systematic criminal conspiracy that stole millions of dollars in federal assistance from families who desperately needed help while enriching people who weren't entitled to receive benefits. The evidence shows that defendants knew their activities were illegal, took steps to conceal their crimes, and continued similar criminal activities for decades after the original fraud. This isn't historical misunderstanding, this is ongoing criminal enterprise that finally faces accountability through Maria Gonzalez's courage in ensuring that evidence preserved by Carlos and Esperanza Morales reached federal authorities. Your verdict will determine whether systematic fraud and civil rights violations will finally face consequences, or whether powerful families can continue to escape accountability for crimes that have affected generations of minority farming families. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against 15 of the 17 defendants. 2 elderly defendants were acquitted due to evidence that their participation had been minimal and that they had withdrawn from criminal activities decades earlier. The sentences ranged from probation and community service for elderly defendants with limited involvement to federal prison terms and substantial financial penalties for leaders who had coordinated ongoing criminal activities. More importantly, convictions triggered civil forfeiture proceedings that would recover millions of dollars in stolen federal assistance for distribution to affected families. But the criminal prosecution was only one aspect of justice that emerged from Maria's discovery of Esperanza's evidence. Professor Chen's civil rights litigation resulted in a comprehensive settlement that provided compensation for hundreds of minority farming families who had been illegally excluded from federal assistance programs. The settlement included individual payments to affected families, funding for agricultural development programs specifically designed to address historical discrimination, and policy reforms that strengthened civil rights enforcement in current federal agricultural programs. Most significantly, the federal investigation triggered a comprehensive review of agricultural program administration that revealed similar discriminatory practices in multiple states, leading to the largest civil rights enforcement action in the history of federal agricultural programs. 6 months after the trial concluded, Maria and Diego returned to the Millfield farmhouse to find a community that had been fundamentally changed by federal prosecution of systematic fraud and civil rights violations. Many of the families involved in criminal activities had left the area, unable to maintain their social standing or economic influence after conviction and civil penalties. But the community had also gained new residents, minority farming families who used settlement funds to purchase agricultural land and restart farming operations that had been destroyed by decades of systematic discrimination. The Millfield area was experiencing agricultural renewal as federal assistance finally reached families who had been excluded for generations. Diego's return to Millfield Elementary was celebrated by classmates and teachers who had followed news coverage of the federal prosecution and understood that his family's courage had helped achieve justice for many community members. His health continued to thrive in the rural environment. His perspective on complex social issues impressed adults who recognized wisdom that extended far beyond his chronological age. Diego asked his teacher, Mrs. Palmer, during a classroom discussion about community service, "What did you learn from your family's experience with the federal investigation?" "I learned that sometimes doing the right thing is scary and complicated. But it's still the right thing," Diego replied with characteristic directness. "And I learned that when good people work together to tell the truth, they can help fix problems that have been hurting families for a really long time." "What advice would you give to other kids who discover that adults are doing things that aren't fair?" "I would tell them to find grown-ups who care more about helping people than about protecting people who do bad things. And I would tell them that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." Maria's role in the federal prosecution had transformed her from a struggling single mother into a recognized advocate for civil rights enforcement and government accountability. She received the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for her decision to pursue federal investigation despite local pressure and personal risks. But more importantly, she had established the Carlos and Esperanza Morales Foundation, which provided legal support and historical research assistance for families who discovered evidence of government fraud or civil rights violations. The foundation operated from the Millfield farmhouse, which had been expanded to include research facilities and secure document storage for sensitive historical materials. The foundation exists because Carlos and Esperanza spent their lives proving that ordinary people can document systematic injustice and preserve evidence until the right moment arrives for justice to be served. Maria explained during the foundation's dedication ceremony, "Our mission is to help other families ensure that evidence of government wrongdoing reaches authorities who will pursue accountability regardless of political pressure or local influence." As the ceremony was attended by federal officials, civil rights leaders, representatives from minority farming families across the Midwest who had benefited from settlement funds and policy reforms triggered by Esperanza's evidence. Most moving was the presence of Rosa Martinez and other elderly survivors of systematic discrimination, who had lived long enough to see their experiences validated and their families compensated for opportunities that had been stolen decades earlier. "I never thought I would live to see justice for what happened to my family," Rosa said during her remarks at the dedication. Maria and Diego's courage in preserving and sharing Esperanza's evidence gave us something we thought was lost forever: official recognition that we deserved better and that the people who hurt us were wrong. But more than justice for the past, this foundation will help prevent similar injustices in the future. Young families will know that evidence of government wrongdoing can be preserved and that truth can overcome political influence when ordinary people have the courage to demand accountability. The farmhouse where Esperanza had waited so patiently for the right people to ensure that her husband's documentation would reach appropriate authorities had become a symbol of the possibility that individual courage could overcome institutional efforts to suppress uncomfortable truths about systematic government failures. Diego, now 7 years old, and thriving in his role as the Foundation's youngest advocate, had become a sought-after speaker at civil rights events where his perspective on moral courage and justice inspired adults who struggled with complex political and legal challenges. Sometimes grown-ups make things seem really complicated when they're actually pretty simple. Diego said during a speech at the University of Iowa Law School, "If someone is doing something that hurts other people, and you have proof that they're doing bad things, then you should give the proof to people who can make them stop hurting people. It doesn't matter if the people doing bad things are important or if other people want to protect them. It doesn't matter if telling the truth makes some people mad or causes problems for your family." Great-Great-and Esperanza taught us that some things are more important than being comfortable or safe. She taught us that when you have evidence that can help families who are hurt by bad things, you have to be brave enough to make sure the evidence reaches people who can use it to help. Even if being brave is scary, even if it changes your whole life. As Maria listened to her son articulate principles that had guided their family through the most challenging period of their lives, she reflected on how completely their simple plan for a fresh start had evolved into a mission that would affect agricultural civil rights enforcement for generations. The inheritance that had seemed like a blessing focused on financial stability had become a legacy that extended far beyond personal benefit to encompass historical truth. Criminal accountability and policy reform that would prevent similar injustices for future generations. The quiet farmhouse that had provided refuge from urban struggles had become the center of national conversations about government accountability, institutional reform, and the power of ordinary citizens to demand justice when powerful interests preferred to maintain systems that benefited them at the expense of vulnerable communities. Most importantly, Diego had learned that courage could be demonstrated at any age, and that moral clarity tone often provided better guidance than adult complexity. When fundamental questions of right and wrong required immediate action, 2 years after discovering Esperanza's hidden evidence, Maria stood once again in the living room where their journey had begun, looking at walls that now displayed photographs documenting the families who had benefited from civil rights enforcement and criminal prosecutions triggered by Carlos and Esperanza's documentation. The Carlos and Esperanza Morales Foundation had helped secure justice in similar cases across 12 states, assisting families who discovered evidence of government fraud, discrimination, or institutional cover-ups that required federal investigation and prosecution. Diego had grown into his role as the Foundation's most effective advocate, his perspective on justice and accountability inspiring audiences who recognized wisdom that transcended his young age and limited life experience. "Mom," Diego said as they prepared for their evening routine in the farmhouse that had become both their home and their life's work, "do you think Great-Great-and Esperanza knew that finding her evidence would help so many families besides just ours?" "I think she hoped it would," Maria replied, looking out at countryside where minority farming families were rebuilding agricultural operations with settlement funds and federal assistance that was finally being distributed fairly. "But I think she chose us because she believed we would be brave enough to make sure her evidence helped as many people as possible, even if that meant our lives became more complicated than we planned." "Are you glad our lives became complicated?" "Glad. We were brave enough to do what Esperanza hoped we would do. I'm glad we helped families get justice that was delayed for too long. And I'm proud that you understood right away that helping other people was more important than keeping our lives simple and safe." "Do you think there are other families who have evidence about bad things but don't know what to do with it?" "I'm sure there are. That's why the Foundation exists, to help people understand that evidence of government wrongdoing can make a difference if it reaches the right people, and that ordinary families can change history when they have the courage to demand accountability." Diego nodded with satisfaction, apparently content that their family's mission would continue helping people for years to come. As night fell over the farmhouse where Carlos and Esperanza had spent decades preserving evidence of systematic injustice, Maria reflected on the journey that had transformed them from people seeking refuge into advocates whose work would affect civil rights enforcement and government accountability for generations. The hidden writing in Esperanza's walls had revealed not just historical fraud, but ongoing criminal activities that required immediate federal intervention. The evidence had triggered prosecutions that sent powerful people to prison, civil rights enforcement that compensated hundreds of affected families, and policy reforms that strengthened protection against discrimination in federal agricultural programs. But most importantly, Diego had learned that age didn't determine the ability to recognize injustice, or the capacity to demand accountability from institutions that preferred comfort over truth. His moral clarity had guided their family through decisions that adults struggled to understand. And his perspective on justice had inspired audiences across the country to prioritize truth over political convenience. The Carlos and Esperanza Morales Foundation continued operating from the farmhouse where Maria and Diego had discovered that ordinary people could hold powerful institutions accountable when they possessed evidence, courage, and determination. To ensure that justice prevailed over institutional protection of criminal activity, Maria Gonzalez, who had inherited far more than a farmhouse, had fulfilled Esperanza's trust by ensuring that evidence of systematic fraud finally reached authorities who pursued prosecutions regardless of local pressure or political influence. Her courage had achieved justice that had been delayed for over 70 years, while establishing institutions that would help other families navigate similar challenges. The story that began with a single mother seeking stability for her son had evolved into a legacy of accountability, truth-telling, and justice that would continue affecting American civil rights enforcement long after Maria and Diego were gone. The farmhouse in Millfield, Iowa, stood as proof that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption when ordinary people refused to accept that. Powerful interests deserved protection from consequences of their criminal activities. Carlos and Esperanza's patient preservation of evidence had finally achieved its intended purpose, and Maria and Diego's determination to pursue justice had ensured that their sacrifice would benefit generations of families who deserved better. From government institutions designed to serve all citizens equally, the hidden writings that had waited decades for discovery had transformed American agricultural policy, brought accountability for systematic fraud, and demonstrated that truth could still prevail when citizens possessed evidence and courage sufficient to demand justice from institutions that preferred protecting powerful interests over serving the public good. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.